What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a side-by-side with Sony's new AZ1 against its former AS100V. Now we're going to put both of these cameras through a variety of tests so you could use any of these quick links here, jump to a section that you're most interested in, otherwise sit back and we'll start playing through all of them. So yeah, let's get out there. Alright guys, so as we get started here, I'll just let you guys know both of these cameras are running their latest firmware. The AS100V is running 2.0, which added a bunch of key features post-launch, so if you don't have that, you're going to want to get that. And the HDR-AZ1 is running its launch firmware, which is just 1.0, and a lot of the features are compatible across both of these cameras. Now we're starting off looking at 1080p 30 frames per second vivid mode. Now what vivid mode is basically just sort of a more saturated and crunched value. It just gives a more appealing image right out of the gate. Now as we're sort of zooming in here to 100%, I want you guys to take a look at the sort of leaves and stuff in the foreground at the very bottom of your screen. You'll notice so at the AS100 it's a little more crisp than compared to the AZ1. Now things in the distance such as the ridgeline and stuff like that, as we zoom into about 200% here, you'll notice aren't too far off from one another, and even stuff in the midground like the forest in the middle are kind of on par, but I don't know if it shows through with the AS100V through the YouTube compression, but it's a good amount sharper, but not as big as a difference as let's say the Hero 4 at 4K, which we looked at in a previous video. Now both of these cameras are filming at their XAVC mode. This is also referred to as Pro mode, and basically it's just a high bitrate version of how you normally film. Now with the AZ1, if you're going through the phone, it's actually under format, so you're going to pick that format as, again, XAVC, but if you're using sort of the remote, it also might be referred to as Pro mode. So we've also switched over our color mode from vivid to neutral. What neutral does is it doesn't assign a sort of black or white level. It leaves it as far open on the spectrum as possible, which basically gives us more ranges. So there's more ranges of blacks, more ranges of white, and then when we want to color correct our footage later, we have all of that information there to play around with. And with the AZ1, there's a noticeable red tint throughout the entire film, and this actually had me questioning why last year I was debating between vivid and neutral mode as my primary sort of filming color grade with the Sony line of cameras, but when I'm looking at the AS100V, I'm not noticing that red tint in neutral mode. But I also find the vivid color mode on the AS100V to be much more appealing. I think the AZ1 is a little more crunched. It maybe isn't picking up as much values. Again, as we zoom in here on vivid mode, like, it doesn't look very far off, but the things on the right side of the screen do feel a little more crunched to me, especially if you look in the mountains in the upper right. There's just a little more range to play with in the upper left, and I just feel like maybe we're losing too much information when we go into vivid mode on the AZ1, and then combine that with the fact that the image is a slightly more muddier. It makes it a little less appealing. But again, we're back in flat mode, and we have this nice bright red car of mine here, and then when we switch it over to vivid mode, it's just going to pop out. And with the AZ1, actually, now that I look at these side by side, they're not too far off. The color profile feels pretty identical. It's a slightly warmer on the AZ1, like those hills on the right have a slightly more red and orange tint to the rocks, while they're a little more white on the left. To be fair, those rocks are actually very white driving up this mountain. This is on the way up to Big Bear Mountain. Dude, these cliffs look awesome with their sort of white rock face and stuff like that. Looking here on the tire treads and stuff like that, both of them share just about the same amount of detail. The same seems to go true for objects in the foreground in this example. Sorry, objects in the background. They're pretty much on the same sort of focal distance, but you can still notice in the clouds there's a slight red tint to the white areas. So we'll take a look at field of view and lens distortion real quick. Now with the Sony line of cameras, the further you get away from the center of the lens, you quickly start to notice a lot of warping and distortion. So if you notice me on the right side of the screen there, I was very bent in a very curved way. And basically as you get to the left and the right side of the screen, we start to bend pretty bad and sort of stretch in and stretch out. And as we get towards the top and the bottom of the frame, we start to bend and sort of curve a lot more. So if we're sort of pointing the camera down and then up, it would be a very noticeable sort of bend. However, there is one way around that with the Sony cameras, and that is to put your camera in a medium field of view. Now, the only way to do that with the Sony cameras with the AS100 and the AZ1 is to switch it to steady shot mode, which we have here. And we have both of the cameras on 60 frames per second to reduce motion blur as well. But what steady shot is doing is it's taking the extra information that's off frame, and it's using the built-in sort of accelerometer software inside the camera, and it's shifting the footage basically so our center field of view stays the same. So we have this nice sort of steady image, it's less jerky and stuff like that, but when we start to do these bigger motions, you'll notice sometimes the frame will just sort of jolt left or jolt right like it did there a little bit. But depending on how much you're moving and stuff like that, you're going to get this nice, smoother pan. It's not going to help with a lot of high frequency vibrations, like if you were to mount it to a bicycle and you're going downhill, you're rattling and stuff like that. It's not going to really solve that, but if you have it mounted to your chest, with the AZ1 being so small, you can get the chest mount for it and it works great. But vibrations like that, it helps heavily reduce, or like these sort of running shots where we're just sort of slowly going forward, it removes a lot of that subtle vibration. But if you're looking in the corners here, when we're sort of fully zoomed out, you will notice that the corners actually start to distort a lot, and that's because, again, of that extreme lens distortion on the Sony line of cameras. And if you actually wanted to get rid of that, if you wanted to zoom past that, you basically have to zoom up, I think, 130%. It's quite a bit to avoid all that distortion. But for the most part, unless you're looking for it, it goes mainly unnoticed. So comparing these two cameras underwater is a little bit of a challenge, mainly because the default case that they ship with isn't really ideal for filming underwater. Now, they can both go underwater to about 16 feet and stay protected, but they both use, by default, this bubble lens, and what this kind of results in is this sort of blurry image that you're seeing here. They both have this sort of underwater scene setting that you can set that floods the camera with a little more red, and it actually will balance out the colors underwater much nicer. It won't make them as teal or as blue, so you don't need to buy a red filter. But the problem is, most of your footage comes out looking like this, where it's all blurry and muddy. Now, at the time of filming this video, there is no flat lens case for the HDR-AZ1. There is a flat lens case for the HDR-AS100V, and we'll show that in a second, but there's no way to get the results you would like to get out of the camera. But since these cameras are fairly comparable, and since it would seem kind of ridiculous that the HDR-AZ1 wouldn't have a flat lens case at some point, you can theoretically look at the HDR-AS100V flat lens case coming up here in a second, and assume that's what the HDR-AZ1 would look like. And then real quick right here, we'll jump into sort of blue water and give you an idea on what this camera will look like in much bluer water. Before, we had a more teal setting. This is blue, and again, we're using that underwater scene to help balance out the colors and stuff like that, and it's not like an oversaturated blue or teal, which is great. And one other thing to keep in mind is that when I film this video, it's November, and this is not a heated pool, and it is freezing, but I think I pull it off pretty gracefully. So here we are, we're looking at the AS100V with the flat lens. Now, we kept the AZ1 with the sort of bubble lens on the right, but we're not filming these at the same time. With the rig I have, it's kind of impossible. But you can see there's just a huge clarity improvement with the HDR-AS100 with the MPK AS3 flat lens case. It's kind of a pain in the butt to find. I think the Sony store now has it in stock. It's much easier to get, but make sure you get the MPK AS3. It's a weird combination of the original case that shipped with the AS30 some time ago and this new flat lens that was developed for the AS100. So back when Sony first started to do the HDR series, one of the big deals was that it did super slow motion, which at the time was 720p at 120 frames per second. The one big downside of that a lot of people didn't expect was you couldn't record audio when you were filming at such a high frame rate. With the AS100V and the AZ1, that's not true. You can actually film audio in both 60 frames and 120 frames per second. Without really changing any settings. Now, if you want to record in slow motion and not have to slow it down later yourself, in that scenario, you will lose sound. But again, if you're filming it how you normally would 120 frames per second and then slowing it down in post later, then you're going to be able to get sound no problem. Now, the Sony HDR-AS100V and AZ1 both, again, film at 120 frames per second, but at 720p. And you can do 60 frames per second at 1080p. And if you're okay with moving out of high bitrate mode, you know, the Pro mode that we mentioned earlier, you can actually record at 60 frames a second with steady shot on. So you can see here with 720p, we can slow it down to about 4 times as slow as when it was originally filmed. So it's basically playing back at 30 frames per second right now, and yeah, it's just 4 times as slow. So in this next section, I'm going to have my buddy Gavork here play us a few songs on his acoustic guitar. Both of the Sony cameras are using a stereo microphone. It's not really a big spoiler if you've watched the video in the past. The AS100V sounds excellent, and honestly the AZ1 is not far off. Into that section, I kind of said that the AZ1 wasn't far off, but listening to it again, the AZ1 just has a really nice, full and rich sound. The AS100V sounds great, but the AZ1, it's just very rich, and it's just got a lot of range that it's picking up that the AS100 just seems to be missing, especially on the lower frequency side. So this section is meant to sort of focus on our contrast levels, and again with the AZ1 you can see, even though we're both in vivid mode on both cameras, the AZ1 has a slightly redder tint, which makes the sort of pine needle sort of just seem much more warm and rich. And to be honest, at the day we were there, I didn't really notice them looking beautiful. They're probably kind of more flat like they are on the AS100V. You can kind of see as we hit those white values in between the trees, the camera was compensating more for the tree branches and stuff like that being dark, so we're kind of boosting out those white areas. But as we move into a sort of bigger, more wide open, low light area, you can see our background isn't too bad. Yes, we don't have like direct sunlight hitting that area, but as we are moving into low light, it does balance out these areas a little better across the AS100 and the AZ1. Now, both of these cameras, the HDR series, really well known for handling low light really well. I think they're one of the few action cameras you can get that are reliable at night and have consistent results. I think both of these cameras look great in low light. We'll put, both of these right here with these Christmas lights. The AS100 again has those nice bright whites, but the AZ1 is slightly crunching a little more, and we're kind of adding that red tint. You kind of see that in those Christmas lights a little bit, especially in the sky as it's sunny, as the sun's setting. You can kind of see the red in the sky there. Not a lot of green value. Again, we are filming at neutral mode for night mode. In my experience, neutral for night on the HDR series has always been the way to go. Vivid just kind of crunches it too much, and it makes our image a little darker than we'd like. So at this point, the sun is practically all the way set, and you can see that again we're getting nice, consistent low light settings. Both of these cameras are recording that sort of neon light on that carriage fairly well. We're not introducing a lot of grain, but if we do zoom in here, you're going to notice that the image is a fair bit muddy. It's not as crisp and sharp as it was before. That's because even though there isn't a ton of it to see, we are introducing grain to boost up the picture a little bit, and both the HDR series are using that illuminated backlit sensor, and it really helps. Whatever it's doing, it really helps reduce the amount of grain in the picture. And we don't really need to change settings too much with the HDR-AS100 or the AZ1. In fact, we don't really have a lot of settings to change if we aren't happy with the low light conditions. The AZ1 actually, through the phone app, has a ton of options on how you can customize the camera, and it's actually a good area I guess we can pick up that the AS100 is severely lacking in options when you're using the mobile app. You maybe have like 4 options to change on the AS100. Other than that, you have to go on to the physical device and change the rest of the settings, such as color scene, which format you're recording in, and stuff like that, while the HDR-AZ1 will let you change every option you can, but that's also the only way you can change all those options, because if you're not familiar, the AZ1, you cannot change the options on the physical camera other than turning on and off Wi-Fi. Everything else has to be done through the remote app, either through the sort of LCD watch they sell, which has a built-in GPS, which I didn't know in our quick look, but that's how you get the GPS out of the AZ1, is only if you get the new updated remote. Now, again, you can only use the remote or your cell phone app to change all the settings, but it does have physical buttons for starting and recording, but you can't take a photo. I was kind of hoping that there would be a double tap press to take a photo, but again, you need to use the phone to switch it over to the photo mode. It's kind of a pain in the butt. There's one area where the HDR-AS100 is, I don't know, preferable, but having that back button be what you press to take photos actually introduces a little motion blur, as you can see on the left side, because I'm having to physically press that button in some of these shots. And what it's doing is it's taking the photo immediately when I press that button and slightly pushing the camera forward, which adds this sort of shake. The AZ1 has its record button on the top of the camera, so when I press it down, it's not really introducing any shake, and it's also waiting about a half a second before taking the photo, so my thumb has enough time to get away from the camera and the camera will sort of steady itself out. Now, the AS100V is equipped with a 13.5 megapixel lens as opposed to the Sony AZ1, which is filming with a 11.9 megapixel lens. The AS100V's photos have a noticeable sharpness increase if you look at like the headlight here, or if you look at just sort of the guitar wood, the sort of wood grain and stuff like that. There's a lot more detail, but we're gonna hop back to the forest here in a second and look at the AS100. Look at a lot of the foliage in the foreground and stuff like that. The AS100V's is a good amount sharper. The AZ1 isn't far off, and if you're looking at it at a price range, these cameras are about $50 to $100 off, and I don't think they're that far off. But if you want a better photo taking experience, the AZ1 and its button placement is way better. But if you want better quality and you don't mind using the phone app or the remote on your wrist, the AS100V does provide better photos. It's just which one has the better photo experience and which is a better option for you. It's kind of your choice. Anyway guys, if you made it this far into the video and I've helped you a bit, press that like, subscribe, or share button. If I've helped you out a lot, you can consider dropping me a donation or a tip to help me buy more cameras to cover. And speaking of coverage, this isn't the only camera coverage or even accessory coverage we're doing this holiday season. There is a bunch there in these links on the left side here. And if you guys need additional information such as firmware, maybe links, high-res links to these photos, check it out in the information section below. And if you don't see it there, feel free to leave me a question in the comments. It's probably the fastest way I'll get back to you, or you can shoot me an email at markhawkcam@gmail.com. Anyway guys, thanks again for the support, and I'll see you out there.